TOME by Marcus Abshire, an Eldritch horror short story. Chapter 1. Cold crept into Mason's bones. It was a deep, hungry cold, one born from addiction and the unforgiving Arctic wind that blew through Chicago's streets like a starving creature of the deep, forever unsatiated, forever seeking the warmth of the living. Teeth chattered as Mason tried to find a meager spark of comfort by rubbing his gloved hands together while keeping his back to the biting sting of winter's breath. He glanced over and felt a pang of frustration at seeing his perfectly good car idling softly, knowing that inside, blessed warmth awaited. "Still doesn't make any damn sense," Mason grumbled as he kept one eye on the door of Asmidov's Antiques and Uniques and one eye on the waiting comfort on the inside of his car. The night was dark, and no moon shone above. Shadows clung to doorways and stoops, while the soft Christmas lights from a nearby shop stained the piles of hardened snow shades of green and red. Christmas was tomorrow, but that was the last thing rattling around inside Mason's head right now. Even if he had anyone special in his life, and he didn't, he couldn't afford to not stay focused, not if he wanted to live to see the sunrise. It was only 2 days ago when everything had gone from bad to worse. 2 days ago he had been content with his addiction, but that was before he even realized what his chemical curse had cost him, what debt it had already put on his frayed and brittle soul. 2 days ago seemed like a lifetime to him now. Mason, I don't think you are grasping the reality of the situation." Julius spoke with a soft strength. His words weren't rushed, weren't delivered with urgency or agitation, yet goosebumps still erupted along Mason's flesh, and his balls drew close to his stomach as fear sliced through him. Mason looked around out of reflex, like a deer feeling the gaze of a predator. He instinctively searched for an exit, for a way to escape from being hunted and killed. Julius had thick red hair and pale skin dotted with freckles, and he wore a leather jacket that barely managed to hide his large frame. Eyes of a light blue held no warmth, no mercy as they watched Mason squirm. Behind Julius, another man stood in front of the only door in the hotel room. He held his arms across his chest and rested them on his large belly. Where Julius was thick with muscle, it was dense and cut as though he had just stepped out of a boxing ring, all sharp edges and pain, while his friend had the form of a power lifter. His shoulders spanned the narrow hallway, and he stood as though thick roots held him firmly in place. Mason looked behind him, seeing a hazy reflection in the window. He used to be healthier and in better shape, but that was a few years ago when he had cared about his health more than he had cared about his next hit. Now he was smaller in stature, thinner in hair and appearance. His eyes, dark brown with black eyebrows, looked around with panic, a panic both Julius and his friend recognized. "There is nowhere to go, Mason," Julius said. I wasn't going anywhere," Mason answered. "Maybe not, but you were thinking about it, weren't you?" Another chunk of burning rock settled in Mason's gut. He heard Julius did horrible things to people that lied to him. Horrible things. Mason's hands fidgeted, and sweat beaded on his head. His heart thumped loudly in his ears as he swallowed. He wasn't sure what Julius was doing here, but he knew it couldn't be good, and the last thing he wanted to do was see just how horrible he treated liars. Yeah, Julius, I was thinking about it." Julius leaned back and smiled. His lips moved, but no joy entered his face. No amusement grew. "There now, honesty. I like honesty. And since you were honest with me, Mason, I am going to be honest with you. He said as he nodded towards his monster of a friend, "came here to do one of 3 things. Get the money you owe us, kill you, or offer you a chance to pay your debt off." Mason's eyes grew large, and he started to speak, but Julius held up a hand and stopped him. "Please, before you say something stupid and get yourself killed, let me explain. You have a problem, you're an addict, and you've managed to spend money you don't have, and take drugs you haven't paid for. In my line of work, people like that aren't always bad. They are investment opportunities. If, and I mean this with a big if, they still have some adequate brain cells rattling around in their heads." "I told you I was going to get your money," Mason tried, but Julius interrupted him. "Stop. Let me finish. I won't tell you again. One more interruption, and I will consider it an admission of an inadequate brain, and useless to me." He paused for a few seconds to see if Mason would talk. After a few pregnant seconds of silence, Julius continued. "Good. Now, as I said, you owe us, and you will pay us in either deed, dollar, or death. Now, seeing as how I don't have a stack of cash in my hand, we are going to assume that you don't have the money. So that leaves us with two options. One, we kill you. It will be painful and bloody. Two, you work for us, do what we say when we say, and do it well. If you fuck up, then we go back to option one." Mason's brain scrambled to try and find a way out. His nerves were shot, and he needed something to take the edge off, but even though the itch inside was growing, he knew that he would never get a chance to scratch it if he was dead. Besides, he liked living. He wasn't in a hurry to end it. He might be able to sell his car and maybe some of his jewelry, but it wouldn't be near enough to pay back what he owed. And he knew that Julius wasn't the kind of guy to let him set up a payment plan. Having your life being the subject of discussion really helped focus the mind. Mason wasn't a hero or a tough guy. He wasn't going to go down fighting, or even make an attempt at fighting his way out of this. He had lived irresponsibly for a while now, and made choices that had slowly and inevitably been like putting a noose over his head and gradually tightening it. Now he stood on a wobbly stool, one strong gust of wind away from the hangman's noose. He didn't want to die. Yes, Julius, working for you sounds good. I'm willing to do whatever you need, man. Whatever." Mason's words came out with a crackling tension he tried to hide, but Julius's smile showed he knew he had Mason boxed into a corner. Excellent choice, excellent choice. Julius reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. "Here, take this. You need to be at this address tomorrow at 6. You're going to be meeting with an associate of mine by the name of Antoine. He will fill you in on what you need to know." Julius stood up and turned to leave. "What exactly am I going to be doing?" Mason said, then added apologetically, "If you don't mind me asking." Julius turned his head slightly. A small predatory smile adorned his mouth. "You're going to be the getaway driver, of course." Chapter 2. Gunshots rang clearly in the cold night, jarring Mason away from his thoughts and for a few seconds, away from his frozen agony. His head whipped around, towards the door of Asmidov's Antiques and Uniques. Screams erupted from inside, and more gunshots followed. Mason wasn't sure what to do. He had been told to park the car, keep it running, and stand outside to keep an eye on anything happening on the street. Antoine insisted that he had to stay out of the car, that he wouldn't be able to see anything if he were sitting in the cab. He thought about reaching up and using the earpiece to contact Antoine, but remembered that he was told to only break radio silence if it was necessary. Antoine had explained explicitly that was only if the car was on fire or the cops were nearby. His indecision became irrelevant when the door to the antique shop slammed open. Antoine hurried out, followed by Tony and Nicky, who had gone inside with him. Both were bruisers and hired thugs. Antwone clutched a large satchel to his chest. In one hand he held a pistol, and once outside, he started waving his other at Mason. "Let's get the fuck out of here," he yelled, as he and his two accomplices ran toward the car. Mason hurried to get behind the wheel, absently noting that Tony was limping as he came, and blood covered his leg, leaving a bloody footprint with each labored step he took. "What the fuck was that?" Mason heard Tony plead as he ripped open the car door and got inside. Antwone threw himself into the passenger seat, and after a few more heartbeats, Nicky and Tony flung themselves into the back seat. "Fucking go!" Antwone yelled as he pointed the pistol at Mason's head. "Seriously, Antwone, what the fuck was that?" "I don't know," Antwone exclaimed. Mason didn't know or care about what they were talking about. Antwone's gun was still pointing at his head, and all he wanted to do was get the fuck out of here before he got his brains blasted to small, unrecognizable bits. He slammed the car into drive, whipped the wheel to the right, and hit the gas pedal. The car's tires squealed for a second before gripping the cold pavement. The car hurtled forward and quickly came to an intersection where Mason slowed just enough to make a right-hand turn. And as he did, he glanced in the rearview mirror, giving him a perfect view of the front door to the antique shop. What he saw sent a ripple of petrified fright through his spine, and if weren't for the gun Antwone still had pointed at his head, he would have frozen and driven the car straight into oncoming traffic. It leaned out the antique store's door. Its upper body was too far forward for gravity to not pull it down, yet it remained leaning as though the laws of physics didn't apply to it. It was dark, and details were hard to discern, but it looked like two arms held onto the door's edge, yet instead of ending in hands, there were multi-segmented insect limbs, each one gripping tightly. Its body was slick, as though it were wet, and the red and green from the neighbor's Christmas lights reflected off its dark, glistening hide. Its head flowed like a tentacle that constantly moved and threaded back and forth, but deep within the darkness, two eyes shone with a crimson glow, two eyes that never wavered or lost focus, two eyes that met Mason's and sent the fear of God through his being. "Hey," Antwone said, demanding Mason's attention. "Huh, what?" "Focus on the road." Mason nodded quickly and did as he was told. Antwone glared at him for a few more seconds before putting his gun down. Mason glanced at the satchel he carried, noting that it too was covered in blood, but he couldn't be sure if it was Tony's or Antwone's. Frightened eyes glanced in the mirror again before returning to the road in fear of Antwone's anger, but even with the threat of a pistol aimed at his head now gone, Mason couldn't get the image of whatever the hell it was lurking from the antique store's doorway out of his mind. Wet, liquid-filled coughing drew Mason's attention, and he saw Antwone hold his forearm up to his mouth. After a short fit of ragged gasps, he brought his arm down, showing bright blood on his jacket sleeve and on his lips and teeth. The two men's eyes met, and Mason saw the pain Antwone was hiding. He moved tenderly, and as Mason noticed, favored the left side of his stomach. "You're hurt," Mason said. "Don't you fucking worry about it. Just drive the damn car," Antwone grumbled back. "Ugh," Tony growled, as Nicky tightened a belt around his upper leg. "We have to get him help," Nicky urged as he stared at Antwone. "How bad is it?" Antwone asked without even looking back. "It's hard to tell. That fucking thing tore his leg up good. If it hit an artery, he'll be dead before we get there." Antwone's face scrunched up in both frustration and pain, but after a few seconds and a stiff examination of Tony's leg, nodded and put his hand up to his ear. There was a burst of static in Mason's own earpiece, and then Antwone's voice saying, "Change of plans, we have wounded, coming to Stitch." "Are you sure Julius is there with his old lady?" a voice answered. Antwone's jaw clenched before he said, "I'm sure." "Okay, how many?" "One." Antwone looked at Mason and dared him to argue. Mason kept his mouth shut. "All right, we'll be ready," the voice in Mason's ear said. "You know Sonny's Deli near Wicker Park." Mason swallowed uneasily. He was told all he had to do was drop Antwone and his two goons off, wait in the unbearable cold, and then drive them back to the same warehouse in Southside, where he picked them up. After that, he was told one of the 5 jobs he owed Julius would have been paid off. Nobody said anything about going to Wicker Park. "Yeah, I know it." "Good, that's where we're going." Mason didn't want to go anywhere other than where he had been told. He wanted to get this job done as fast as he could, get the other 4 done, and get out from under the heel of Julius's custom boots. "Is there a problem with that?" Antwone asked, when Mason didn't answer. "What?" No problem." Antwone looked like he was going to say something, but another coughing fit took him, and he clutched his stomach tighter, holding the satchel covered in blood against his body, like a dying man hoping to clutch just one more second of life. Chapter 3. The deli was attached to a mechanic's shop. When Mason drove up to the door, it opened, and he pulled the car in and parked it. 4 guys waited. One carried a large first aid kit, and the other 2 had a stretcher. "What happened?" the guy holding the first aid kit asked. "I don't fucking know, Stitch. We had the old man tied up, and Antwone found the book. We started to leave, and that's when... Nicky tried to finish, but he couldn't. "That's when what?" Stitch asked. "That's when the old bastard's dog attacked up. Fucking thing was huge, tore Tony's leg up real good." Antwone answered for Nicky, as Tony was loaded up on the stretcher. "A dog?" Stitch asked. "That's what it was, right, Nicky?" Antwone stared at the other man. The weight of his gaze fell heavy, and carried with it a quiet threat and promise of retaliation if Nicky didn't agree. Nicky paused for a second before agreeing. "Yeah, right. A big black fucking dog." Stitch's focus shifted from Nicky to Antwone. You could see the wheels turning behind his glasses, but in the end, he didn't press the issue. If they said it was a dog, then it was a dog. "Take him to the cooler. The cold will help slow the bleeding," Stitch said, nodding towards the men handling Tony. His eyes found Antwone again, and this time he noted the way the man held the satchel close against his body, the way he stood with a stiffness and painful reserve. Drops of blood slowly dripped onto the concrete floor at Antwone's feet. "You coming, Antwone?" Stitch asked, nodding his head towards the man's obvious injuries. "Me? No. I need to see Julius. Where is he?" "Antwone, you're bleeding." "No shit, Stitch, but it can wait. Where is Julius?" Stitch shook his head in defeated confusion, but answered the question anyway. "He's in the office with Cheryl." Antwone turned and walked through a door leading towards the front of the building, and Mason couldn't help but notice the trail of blood he left. He figured his job was done. He got everyone to where they wanted to go, and managed to not get himself killed in the process. Stitch followed Tony through another door, leaving Mason in the garage with Nicky. "Well, if that's it, I guess I'm going to go," Mason said. Nicky looked at him like he forgot he had even been in the room, shrugged his shoulders, and said, "Sorry, you can't leave just yet. Cops are going to be snooping around for a while. Relax, make yourself comfortable. It's almost Christmas." Nicky wasn't a lumbering thug like most of Julius' associates. His beady eyes looked in every corner, and his thin frame held barely restrained energy that showed itself in Nicky's inability to sit still for more than a few seconds. A tap of the feet here, A scratch of the head there. The man was always moving, always in motion. Mason's heart sank. He sure as hell didn't want to stay here any longer than he needed to, but with everything that had happened, he also didn't want to cause any trouble. Nicky walked over and hit a button on the wall, and the garage door lowered. Mason had a moment of panic, where he saw himself jump in his car and haul ass before the door closed, but his cowardice kept him rooted right where he stood. The garage door closed, and a feeling of doom crashed into Mason. It was like darkness had crept into the room, through the shadows and empty spaces, to crawl over his soul. He found himself thinking about the thing he saw. Its insectoid limbs stood out in his mind's eye, and a shiver raced over his skin. Mason looked at Nicky, and for once the man wasn't moving. He just stood there, eyes unfocused, as if he too were lost to his thoughts, imprisoned in his memory. A scream broke the silence, and both Mason and Nicky turned their heads towards where it had come from. Gunfire erupted, and this time more screams filled the garage. Nicky looked at the door where the screams were coming from, and his face paled as his hands shook. He looked from the door to the car, and then to Mason. Finally, he reached over and hit the garage door button, but the door didn't open. He hit it again and again, but still nothing happened. "Come on, fucker," he mumbled as he hit it 3 more times in quick succession. "What are you doing?" Mason asked. "I'm getting the fuck away from here." "Didn't you just tell me to stay put?" "You do what you want, but I don't want to be here. Not if those screams are from what I think they're from." "What are they from?" Mason's voice cracked with tension. "Man, I don't know, okay? All I know is that wasn't no fucking dog that ripped Tony's leg to shreds and almost gutted Antwone." Mason shook his head. He didn't like what Nicky was saying. He didn't like it one bit. What do you mean, what was it?" "I told you I don't fucking know." "Okay, man, okay." Mason held his hands up as he noticed that Nicky had pulled out his pistol and held it in a white-knuckled grip. "Why won't this goddamn door open?" he growled, then went over and tried a side door, but it too wouldn't budge. Nicky reached down and unlocked it, but when he put his weight into it, the door stayed closed, as if something on the other side was preventing it from moving. A cold chill crept over Mason's skin. The door was made to open inwards. "What the fuck?" Nicky snarled and backed away from the door. He whipped his head back and forth as if he were expecting something to flow out of the darkness and rip his spine out of his body. The other door, the one not connected to the sounds of guns and screams, opened, and Antwone stepped into the garage. In one hand he held his pistol, in his other, a golden necklace was wrapped around his closed fist. "What's happening?" he demanded, glaring at Nicky. "I don't know, I just heard gunfire and screaming." "And you what? Decided to try and leave, is that it?" "No, Antwone, ain't that right?" Nicky asked, urging Mason to agree. "I mean, if we could leave, we would have, right?" Mason answered with a sheepish shrug. Mason might be a coward, might be a cockroach just trying not to get squashed, but one thing about cockroaches is they always know how to survive. Antwone nodded. "Okay, fine. How about we go and see what the hell is going on then, huh?" he said. "Of course, Antwone. Of course." Nicky looked away, and then raised his eyes towards Mason with a hint of quiet gratitude. Antwone turned and walked towards the other door with Nicky following close behind. Mason glanced around and looked for something, anything that might offer him a chance at defending himself. On a table, he saw a lug wrench, and as he passed it, he picked it up and followed. Passing through the door, They entered a short hallway. Old, dusty office tiles sagged overhead, and a smell of mildew and onions filled the air. Mason's heart thumped in his chest, and his sweaty palm made his grip weak. He felt like a rat trapped in an experiment, one where if it made the wrong move, death awaited. Antoine came to a door, reached out, grabbed the handle, and knocked. "Hey, Stitch, you okay, man?" he asked. No one answered. "Hey, Stitch," Antoine repeated louder this time, but again, no one answered. He waited a few more seconds and then said without turning around, "When I open the door, I'll go left. Nicky, you go right. Mason, come in last." "Wait, that puts me right in the middle of the door," Mason argued, but Antoine lunged forward, slammed into the door, and forced it open. He stayed low and then moved to the left. Nicky followed and moved to the right. Both held their pistols up at the ready. The men moved fast, faster than Mason had been ready for, and without thinking he stepped up and stood dead center of the door, with a full view of the horror that lay in front of him. His eyes swept the room, and every detail of what he saw etched itself into the deep crevices of his brain. Red, vivid red covered the walls, and it took Mason a few seconds to realize it hadn't been painted that way, at least not originally. As he looked, he noticed small bits of bone, tissue, patches of hair, and God knew what else stuck to the lifeblood that now slowly pooled on the floor. A small bit of something fell from the ceiling, and it made a soft, meaty thud as it hit the hard concrete. Off to the right, the bottom half of someone's leg sat against a chair, as if it had just been placed there with loving care. Mason saw a finger lying amidst a small stretch of intestines, and on a desk, an intact eyeball watched the three men with dead intensity. Bile rose in the back of Mason's throat as the smell hit him. It was strong with the coppery tinge of blood, but it also had the vile sting of a sour stomach and raw meat. Nicky stepped away, and the sound of his retching pushed Mason over the edge, and without being able to stop it, he bent over and threw up. "What in all that is holy?" Antoine muttered, as Mason and Nicky gathered themselves. "It looks like—" Nicky tried to finish but couldn't. "Where's the rest of them?" Mason asked with gentle horror, and as he glanced around at the macabre scene, he managed to find enough pieces and body parts to make an educated guess. "Looks like Stitch, Tony, and Creed," Antoine intoned. "Who could have done this?" Nicky moaned. Antoine looked at Nicky, and a shadow fell over his features. "What the hell was that back in the antique store, Antoine?" Nicky urged. Antoine didn't back down from Nicky's gaze, and after a few seconds he drew in a breath to say something, but a sound drew all three men's attention and cut short any answer Antoine might have given. It started off soft, but gradually grew. Like a tornado siren, it drove into the brain and caused all three men to wince. It wasn't like anything Mason had ever heard, but still, his brain drove him back in time, to when he was a kid and sat in the living room watching horror movies while his mom was entertaining her guest. Then, in the dark of night, some monster or ghost would wail in a siren call of terror and unearthly gloom. It was a sound of helplessness, pain, and torture. It was a sound that foretold suffering, despair, and agony. The wailing reminded him of that, of a call for death, for loneliness, and empty sorrow. The wailing crawled under his skin and threatened to once again drive the bile that had stung the back of his throat to come back up. A few seconds later it ended, trailing off into echoes and a promise of blood. Antoine didn't wait for Nicky or Mason to start asking questions he had no intention of answering. "Nicky, you're coming with me. Mason, get your ass back into the garage, and if anyone comes towards you, bash its fucking skull in. Mason recoiled. "I'm not a killer man. I just was supposed to drive," he pleaded. Antwone growled. "No one gives a fuck. If you don't do what I say, I'll shoot you right now." He emphasized his point by aiming his pistol at Mason's head. Okay, I'll go." Mason capitulated as he held up his hands in defeat. "Good. Remember, if anything comes in there, you hit it until it stops moving. Understand?" Yeah, no, I got it," Mason said as he backed out of the room and headed back to the garage. "Lock the door behind you," Antwone ordered, and Mason did as he was told. Mason was just supposed to have been a driver. It was supposed to have been an easy job, but now, Mason thought, it had turned into something else. The unease he had felt ever since he had glanced in the mirror crept back, and Mason went over and sat with his back against the wall facing the door. He gripped the wrench and tried to pry strength from it, but the pit of dread that had rooted in his stomach began to grow as his brain kept showing him images of the bloody walls, bits of bone, and body parts that had been all that remained of three, just a few minutes ago, lively men. "It's fine," he said. His words echoed slightly in the empty garage. "Antwone and Nicky have everything under control. They will deal with it, and in a few minutes, I'll be able to go. It's fine." Mason spoke, with the conviction of a man that just found religion, a man that had to believe in something bigger than himself, or risk going insane. "It's fine. It's going to be fine," he repeated, and as he did, a small bit of comfort returned. Mason took a deep breath, and as he exhaled, all the lights went out. His world was plunged into darkness, and panic raced through his body. His stomach twisted into knots, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. He whipped his head around in terror at what he felt was lurking in the darkness, just out of reach, but all he could see were shadows and darkness, as the black that filled the room was absolute. A scratching came from the locked door, and his ears zeroed in on the noise. His head focused on where the sound was coming from, and his eyes slowly began to adjust to the lack of light, allowing him to see shapes among the shadows. The door he had come through, the one he had locked, held abysmal black, and from within its depths he saw movement. It was an unending swaying, a disjointed push and pull of shapes that were just out of reach for his eyes to discern. There, in the darkness of the doorway, among the movement that he could not define, a voice slithered over him. It was deep, powerful, and held the promise of agony's kiss as it caused shivers to race down Mason's spine. "Why do you put your faith in such weak beings?" the voice asked. Chapter 4. "What? Who is that?" Mason exclaimed, and almost fell off the chair. "I am the bringer of a dark god. I am the judgment before night. I am eternal suffering and agony. My name would drive you crazy, and my true form would eradicate your soul." "I don't understand. Nor would I expect you to, Mason. I have answered your question with honesty. Answer mine the same, or suffer." The darkness slithered closer, and its words cut through Mason's mind like a scythe. Just the threat of pain was enough to wound. "I don't know what you mean," Mason answered with as much truth as he knew. "Your prayers, your chants, and words. You put your faith in men of soiled sin. My question is simple. Why?" I don't," Mason muttered, unable to finish, but in his mind he felt a cloying presence, a powerful visitor that plucked his thoughts without his consent. "You don't know what else to do you? Is it because you are weak, Mason?" Mason nodded his head, knowing that no answer could deceive this presence, no truth could be hidden. Yes, he admitted. Aren't you tired of being weak Mason? Held captive by your need for pleasure? Held hostage by the confines of those stronger? It's all right, Mason. I know what it feels like to be weak, to be used by others. There is another way, Mason. There is a way for you to be strong, to have what you truly desire. Mason was drawn into its words, its promises and deceits. It spoke with conviction and understanding, respect and regret. Mason could, if he just pushed aside his doubts and fears, believe that this presence wanted to help him. If only he could stop the voices of reason that rattled around in his brain. How? Mason whispered. You must surrender, Mason. Surrender your will, your body, and your soul. Give that which has been given, and you will know wonders you could not possibly imagine. Its voice rolled over and through Mason, and in it he saw himself proud and strong. He was who he imagined, who he wanted to be, a man of strength and confidence, a man who knew what he wanted. He was a man to be admired. But I don't understand what you mean, Mason huffed. The darkness began to fade back into the shadows. The cloying presence receded and slithered away like a fog that is driven back into the cracks from which it came. On the dwindling tethers of nothing, the voice spoke again, this time its echoes slowly fading until all that remained was quiet. You will, it said. Mason's thoughts drifted on the dying whispers of its voice, his mind filled with the idea of who he could be, not who he was, and despite everything that was happening, Mason smiled. A few minutes later the lights flickered back on, and Mason's thoughts drifted back to the here and now. Cold dread settled back into place in the pit of his stomach. Now that the lights were on, and reality had become normal again, Mason did what he did best, rationalizing his way out of thinking about what was right in front of his face. He was an addict. Addicts were masters of finding ways to avoid reality. They did mental gymnastics to justify seeking chemical oblivion over and over, even though their lives were spiraling out of control. The people who cared about them saw it, and were tortured by watching those they loved choose hollow bliss over stability. But the addict, they made it make sense, at least to them. Mason had already started to rationalize away what had just happened, convincing himself that it had been a power surge, and that someone, one of Julius's hired thugs, was fucking with him. Never mind the room covered in blood and body parts. Never mind the feeling of something prying through his mind. Never mind the instinctual fear that had filled his soul. Those things were too real, too raw to accept. This whole situation had gone straight to shit, and Mason's #1 priority right now was getting out of here alive. Cockroaches excelled at survival, and they knew how to scurry into the shadows when needed, and how to slink around, finding what they needed to live. Mason inched over to the door and went into the hallway, but instead of going towards the blood-covered room, he turned left and made his way to the closed door that led to where Antoine and Nicky had gone. Reaching out, he gently tried the handle, but it was locked. Voices from the other side drew his attention, and he leaned down, able to make out what they were saying. As long as I have the book, we'll be fine, Julius calmly stated. Tell that to Stitch and the others, Nicky exclaimed. Nicky, Antoine warned. No, it's okay. Nicky has every right to be afraid. Damn right I'm afraid. Did you see what happened? Did you see the blood? That shit ain't natural. What happened to them ain't normal. You're right. It's not, Julius agreed. What? Nicky huffed. It's not normal. It's powerful, deadly, and more dangerous than you could possibly imagine. That old man was right, wasn't he? We've killed ourselves. We just don't know it, haven't we? Nicky demanded. I told you as long as I have this book, we'll be fine. Yeah, I heard that. But that didn't help the others, did it? Fuck this man. I'm getting out of here. Nicky, sit down, Antwone ordered. Besides, where are you going to go? The doors are all sealed shut. Julius explained. Yeah, well, you said that book is important to it, right? What if I take it, huh? Nicky, don't be an idiot. Put the gun away, Antwone told him. Just give me the fucking book, Julius. Give me the book, and I won't shoot you. Nicky, you still don't understand, do you? 2 gunshots ripped through the air and blasted against Mason's ears, causing him to squeal in surprise and fall back out of shock. He hit his butt hard, and his jaw slammed down on his tongue with a painful bite. Fuck, Mason cursed. He slowly got to his feet and started to back away when Antwone swung the door open and held his pistol at Mason. Told you I heard something, he said. Julius leaned over and saw Mason standing like a deer caught in headlights while standing on the highway as a semi barrels toward it. Bring him inside. If he proves he has half a brain, he may be useful. Antwone waved his pistol and said, You heard the man. Get your ass in here, Mason. Mason swallowed hard and tasted the coppery sting of his own blood. That dread, the sinking feeling that he was descending deeper and deeper into a pit of unescapable doom, grew tenfold as he did as he was told and walked out of the hallway and into the room. Chapter 5. Mason was surprised at the size and luxuriousness that surrounded him. The building held a deli and a car detail shop. The first sold quality sandwiches and meats, but the detail shop was a front. It had a few purposes. One was a chop shop where stolen cars came to be processed for resale. The second purpose was a staging center for drugs and other stolen items that were then distributed to the dealers on the streets and vendors, depending on the product. Anyone dealing with either the deli side or the chop shop side would never have thought that a building as bland and unassuming as this one held within it an office that would have been right at home in a CEO's multi-billion-dollar company. There was a large desk made of deep mahogany with a luxurious chair in which Julius sat. To the right, a leather couch held a woman with blonde hair, a tight dress, and eyes that held beauty, but also a cunning intelligence. A conference table occupied the space in front of the desk, and more chairs surrounded it. There was a flat-screen television on one wall, whose volume was muted, but displayed a well-known show that talked about all things money and markets. The carpet was thick, and everything in the room screamed expensive luxury. Antwone walked over to the left of the conference room, where Nicky's body lay on the carpet, a pool of fresh blood already soaking into the lush flooring. Julius studied Mason as he stood just inside the room. A large book sat on the desk in front of Julius. Its cover was black, and the thickness of its contents and old bindings made Mason think that the word book didn't do it justice. Tome, that was a far more accurate description. You look scared. Are you scared? The woman, Cheryl, said to Mason, her head tilted to the side slightly, as if she were a praying mantis deciding what part of Mason she was going to start eating first. Don't be silly, of course he's scared, Julius said. He would be a fool to not be scared. You're not a fool, are you? Cheryl asked with a curious inclination. He's still alive, so either he's lucky or has enough survival instincts to keep him breathing. Fools die. Just ask Nicky. Take a seat, Mason. You are about to witness something few have ever seen, Julius said, speaking with a smooth and relaxed tone. Mason, like a good cockroach, took a seat and kept quiet. Julius reached out and held a glass. "Get me some of his blood, would you, darling?" Cheryl smiled, and to Mason, it reminded him of a shark, all tooth and no joy. She got up, moving with the delicate grace needed to manage a tight dress, with modesty. She handed the cup to Antwone, who knelt and filled half of it with thick blood, then gave it back to her. "You sure you can read that?" she asked, as she put the glass on the desk next to the tome Julius was studiously concentrated on. "I told you, dear, the book has chosen me," he said, then looked up at her confidently and added, "I can read it." Mason didn't like where this was going. He had seen enough movies and shows to know that using an old and creepy-looking book that no one could read wasn't going to end well. Using the blood of a newly murdered man just added to the "this is a bad fucking idea" factor that had been growing inside Mason ever since the garage door closed and locked him in. Antwone stood off to the side, his pistol still held firmly in his hand. The man was hard to read, but Mason's life had been dangling on a string ever since he met with Julius a few days ago, and that kind of intensity tended to make you either step up your game or wind up dead. If Mason had to decipher what was going on in Antwone's head, he'd say the man looked like someone who knew shit had gone off the deep end, but who thought if he did what he was told, played the hand he was dealt, he might just get out without losing his own stack, maybe even getting some of the pot as well. With hands clenched tightly on the chair's armrests, Mason gritted his teeth as Julius began reading from the book. The words felt strange and yet melodic. They held weight, and as Julius spoke, that weight seemed to fall on everything and everyone in the room, as if an invisible blanket of fate had been unfurled and settled in a billowy promise of oblivion. 10 seconds went by, 15, then 20, as Julius's words rose in pitch, and with one final oration, ended. Julius looked as though he had just run a marathon. His body dripped in sweat, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. Silence filled the room, and Cheryl looked around with restrained impatience. Finally, after a long, uneasy length of quiet, she asked, "Is that it?" Julius focused on her, and a wave of rage crashed across his features. Mason slunk lower in his chair, hiding from the power of that look, but as quickly as it came, just as fast, it shifted. Rage morphed into agony as Julius's mouth opened in a wordless scream. His body lifted on unseen arms, and his feet dangled a foot off the floor, arms outstretched, and for a few seconds he looked like a modern Jesus hanging on the cross, a bastardized version of the holy symbol, one of a man unworthy and soiled in sin. Dark, evil power rippled through the office, and Julius's body bent backward. His spine snapped as it contorted. Shoulder blades met the back of his legs as Julius was literally folded in half. His jaw opened wide, muscle and tendon stretched to breaking. The skin on his stomach could be seen as his shirt had been pulled up, and Mason watched in abject horror as something ripped his stomach open. Blood sprayed across the room and a fine mist fell, covering the table and Mason in a crimson sheen. Julius's intestines shot out of the open wound, and like streamers attached to a room fan, they snapped back and forth in a macabre undulation. Mason dimly heard Sherry's screaming as he scrambled away from the table and backed into the wall, trying to get as far away from the floating massacre as he could. Antwone held his pistol at the ready, but his face had gone pale and his hands shook. The crack of gunfire filled the office as Antwone unloaded his clip into the grotesque figure before them. The rounds struck home. Bone, flesh, and blood flew as the bullets ripped through Julius's body, but still The dance continued, and the horror remained. With the clip emptied, the room fell silent. Intestines continued to flap about, and blood covered everything. It splattered the wall behind Julius and dripped from his feet as it poured from his stomach and mouth. Julius's upturned head turned, impossibly wrenching itself to face Antwone. Bone cracked and ripples of electric fear immobilized Mason as he watched. Antwone, your loyalty to Julius is admirable, but your actions are pitiful. The dark will come. The abyss is near. Mason's horror redoubled as the same voice that had spoken to him earlier rolled through the room. "Fuck this," Antwone hissed. He turned from Julius's body and scampered across the room. Cheryl's fear finally broke as her own survival instincts kicked in, and she followed Antwone. Mason knew he didn't want to stay here. Whatever was happening to Julius was not something he should be seeing, and if he stayed, the same evil would be turned on him. His legs moved as he ordered them, and he scooted across the wall, towards the door. Pain lanced through him as his back scraped against a painting and light switch, but he didn't care. As he slinked through the door leading down the hall, his eyes never left Julius, never left the bloody and horrific display. Before he finally broke eye contact and fled toward the garage, he saw, behind Julius, like a mirage that wavered to life through waves of heat, a figure loomed over the body. It was the same thing he had spied in the doorway of Asmidov's Antiques and Uniques, and the same thing he had seen in the shadows and darkness. Insect limbs held Julius's body, and a dark carapace glistened as two eyes deep within undulating darkness focused on Mason. There is no escape from judgment. It spoke, and as it did, dread erupted anew in the pit of Mason's stomach. His legs drove him back, and finally he turned and followed Antwone and Cheryl into the garage. Chapter 6. "Lock the damn door," Cheryl told Mason, her once pretty face now marred by taut lines of panic and horror. "I fucking told Julius not to mess with that goddamn book," Antwone cursed while searching for a way out of the garage. He smacked the door opener, but just as before, nothing happened. Mason watched him stomp towards the smaller door on the side and shook his head as Antwone came to the same realization as Mason. They had nowhere to go. "Mason," Antwone said, but Mason wasn't listening. His mind kept replaying the words from the darkness. "Mason." This time the urgency in Antwone's voice cut through his dreadful fixation. "Huh? What? You have the keys to this car?" Mason's brain took a few seconds to register what Antwone was asking him, and when it did, Mason realized their escape had been in his control this whole time. Yeah, I do." A small flicker of hope that he might still get out of this alive ignited inside Mason as he dug in his pocket and pulled out the keys. Antwone gave Cheryl a pointed glance, as she had come to the same conclusion as Mason. "Fucking brilliant," she said. All three of them got into the car. Mason started it, put on his seatbelt, and waited for just a few seconds for the others to put on theirs. Then he put the car in reverse, muttered a soft prayer under his breath, and slammed the gas. They tensed, anticipating the jarring kick of acceleration and the violent impact as they crashed through the garage door, but it never came. Instead, Mason felt the engine buck and heard tires scream while the stinging scent of burnt rubber filled the cab, but the car didn't move. He looked in the rearview mirror, and there, filling his view and standing behind the car, the thing that had bent Julius in half and crushed his spine stood holding onto the metal frame, using its insect-like appendages and power to keep the car from moving. Metal screamed as the obsidian monster crushed steel and kept anyone from escaping. "Why aren't we moving?" Cheryl cried, but Antoine's face, his resigned scowl, showed that he already knew. Mason had to give him credit for his stoic courage, as he noted that while he reached into his jacket, pulled out another clip, and reloaded his pistol, his hands only shook a little. Antoine took a deep breath, and then he opened the passenger side door and rolled away from the car. Movement from behind drew Mason's attention. The creature let go of the car with one of its multi-segmented appendages. "Oh my God, what the fuck is that?" Cheryl screamed as she finally saw what Mason had seen, had finally laid eyes upon the doom that had been following them since the antique store. Her words were cut short when the appendage that wasn't holding onto the car crashed through the back windshield and drove through the side of Cheryl's head and out the other side. Blood and bits of brain splattered against the inside of the cab, and Mason had to close his eyes to keep the warm bits of what was left of Cheryl's head and brain from getting into them. He managed to protect his eyes, but felt a salty and soft piece of something in his mouth, since it had been open, stretched wide while he had been screaming the whole time, and hadn't even realized it. Mason spit out the chunk of Cheryl and fought to keep himself from throwing up all over the place while he unlatched his seatbelt and threw himself out of the car. He hit the hard concrete floor and heard metal grinding as the horror that had kept them from escaping ripped into Mason's car. Out of the corner of his eye, Mason saw Antoine stand up, hold his pistol in both hands, take careful aim, and once again start firing. The bullet slammed into the dark carapace, cleaving chunks of it off as hot lead ripped through the monster's body. It slowly turned to face Antoine and patiently waited until his pistol was empty. Then it twisted and used what was left of Mason's car like a baseball bat to swat Antoine across the room and into the far wall. Metal screamed in protest, and there was a wet, meaty slap before Antoine was airborne. When he hit the wall, bone broke, and his left leg snapped. The clear sound of it, cracking, drove deep into Mason's head, causing him to shudder. Blood spread from where bone clearly pierced through the meaty part of Antoine's thigh. His eyes grew red, and blood seeped from his nose. From behind his head, blood dripped from where his skull had been cracked open. The pistol dropped from his grip, and his other leg twitched, with a spasmodic rhythm. The dark monster dropped the car, and with a grace that belied natural law, drifted to Antoine. Its insect limbs gently gathered the injured man's head, and helped him turn to look into the thing's crimson eyes. It held him, watching as with every passing second, death took its rightful reward. The thing sighed in ecstasy as it savored watching all life seep from Antoine's eyes. With one last undulating huff of pleasure, it turned and faced Mason. Chapter 7. The time is now, Mason. Choose. Give us your soul, your life, your will, and we shall grant you pleasures beyond reason, power beyond knowing. Its voice, filled with alien power, rolled over and through Mason. Once again he saw himself as he wished, proud, strong, and a power of his own. He didn't need chemicals to be happy, didn't need oblivion to escape reality. He had everything and anyone he wished. Mason knew that what he was about to ask might doom him, might seal his fate, for even he understood that to deal with a being such as this, something as close to an actual demon as he could ever imagine, would not end in his favor. The understanding that deals made with evil always came with a price, and always carried a heavy burden was not lost on Mason, but still he had to know. "What is it I need to do?" he asked, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he might still get out of this alive. "Yes," it moaned. "Relinquish your will, subserviate yourself before us, bow to us and allow us in and through," it said, in eager anticipation. Mason could see it as clear as day now. No wavering mirage stood before him. No shadowy veil disguised it. The thing stood 9 feet tall, its shoulders wider than a door, as a black carapace covered its body and shone in wetness. Blood pooled at its feet, strange alien feet that spread out like a fan and had a dozen insect limbs instead of toes. Arms ending in more insect limbs moved with a continuous clacking as they brushed across each other. Crimson eyes watched Mason from deep within the darkness that moved as though it were a tentacle, constantly searching, seeking for a new victim to squeeze and strangle. Mason was never the kind of man to make clear, decisive choices, and as the creature's words vibrated through the garage and wormed their way into his brain, he found that even now, his indecision remained. Choose now, Mason. The light is near. The choice must be made. Again its words hit Mason with a solidity that staggered him. It moved back and forth with impatience, and Mason saw something else. Dark blood flowed over the ground and toward the creature. It came from the hallway, from the room where Stitch and his crew had been slaughtered, from where Julius had been folded in half, from Cheryl's immobile body, and from Antoine's crushed form. The blood ran like individual rivers and pooled at the creature's feet. It carried with it bits of dirt and debris, parts of body, hair, and bone. The blood thickened, and the creature kept its gaze on Mason. "Choose." Mason froze. He wanted what it promised, wanted to be what he saw, but something inside of him stopped him from answering, stopped him from dropping to his knees, and instead of doing as the thing asked, Mason just stood there. The creature took a step forward, and then looked up, past Mason, and stopped. It then looked down, back at Mason, and spoke. "My existence is eternal, my purpose yet unfulfilled. Humanity will never know how much it owes you, Mason. Light brings a new dawn, and with it a new chance at sweet oblivion." The blood moved, flowing past the creature's feet and towards Mason. He tried to move, but the creature reached out and held him firm. Its insect-like appendages gripped his arms, and pain seared him. Yet he couldn't keep his eyes from the blood that flowed over his feet and up his legs. It was still warm as it made its way over his stomach and his neck. A scream tore through Mason, but it quickly became gurgled as the blood raced into his mouth and nose, quickly filling his belly with its sticky intrusion. He felt his stomach stretch, felt it rip as the blood forced its way in. He felt his organs rupture, and his lungs fill with blood. Agony, pure agony, tore him apart as the blood filled him. The creature's grip tightened and forced Mason to stare into its crimson gaze. As it watched him, it pulled and drove its face into his chest. A red gout of blood shot from where it ripped through skin and bone, and a crimson spray filled the air. Pain, more agony than Mason ever dreamed existed, filled his mind, filled his soul as it became not something he felt, but something he existed within. The creature thrashed and ripped Mason's body apart. Darkness filled his vision as death arrived. He fell and landed on the floor, his head turned towards the garage door. There he saw the first rays of dawn's light spilling through a small window. As his brain registered the light, he thought of one thing. One idea repeated itself over and over with unceasing urgency. Death took him. Darkness surrounded him, and all he could think was that today was Christmas morning. Chapter 8. In Julius's office, the Black Tome's pages flipped back and forth from an unseen wind. Rage and fury filled the space and funneled back into the book from whence they had sprung. Christmas morning arrived, and the book slammed shut once more.